Good evening, everybody. It's good to see everybody on so bright and early. I'm Dr. Makungu Akinyela from the Africana Studies Department here at Georgia State University, and I am excited and happy to be able to moderate this final Freedom School 4.0 lecture of the semester. We've got an exciting topic. I can't wait to hear what our speaker has to say, but first let me introduce her. Dr. Natasha Johnson is a clinical instructor and director of the M.I.S. program in criminal justice administration at Georgia State University. A career educator since 2001, her research is focused on critical theory, equity, and social justice leadership, particularly within the K through 20 sector. Her other research areas include intersectionality, educational law policy, and governance and curriculum development. Dr. Johnson holds multi-state reciprocity and has previously worked as a teacher, guidance counselor, assistant dean, instructional leader, and curriculum developer in New York, Mississippi, and Jamaica, West Indies. She is a 2019 UCEA, the University Council of Educational Administration, in conjunction with the American Educational Research Association, AERA, David L. Clark Scholar. A 2020 through 2021 GSU Setlow Faculty Teaching Fellow, and her work is published in Sage, Taylor and Francis, the Rutledge Focus Series, Criminal Justice Review, IGI Global, The Conversation, and USA Today. So we are happy and excited to welcome Dr. Natasha Johnson. Her topic today is the truth about critical theory and why it matters. Dr. Johnson?
Dr. Akinyela, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. You made me sound important. I have been looking forward to this conversation ever since I first connected with the Auburn Avenue Research Library, because of all of the important work that's being done there, and it really shouldn't be siloed anyway. We are all part of this larger community at Georgia State, and I always just relish the chance to engage and to promote and produce these wonderful, rich and ripe and forward progressing conversations. And so the reason why we're here today, and I'm going to share my screen as I say that, because the title of my particular topic is The Truth About Critical Theory and Why It Matters. Just a little sidebar on that. My dissertation, Writing Her Story, it was a phenomenological study in which I looked at the paths and the proclivities and the nuances of the leadership journeys of some Black women in educational leadership. And the reason I'm saying that is because one of the frames I use, I juxtapositions critical race feminist theory with social justice leadership theory, combining the two to not only speak to the voices and experiences of Black women, but really speaking about their paths, their progressions through and to their current leadership positions. And they're still progressing, of course, but the journey itself, and then all of the sacrifices you continue to have to make, all of the things that you still have to do and face to stay there. Like getting to the zenith, the apex, getting to the top of the hill is one thing, but staying there is another. And so this opportunity to strip some of the emotion and some of the nuance and some of the intersecting layers, because there are many, and it's more like an onion, but to really get back to the heart of the matter, the heart of the truth, the heart of where critical theory began, and a lot of what's led us here today, and just to, again, to have a conversation about what critical theory really is all about, and yes, why we should all care. So first, let me just say that this about a year or two ago, right? So within the past couple of years, there's just been a lot of growing noise about suddenly critical race theory took front and center stage in the United States. There's so much back and forth, so much language, so much verbiage, so much connection to other theories, other frameworks, other paths, other frames. I don't want to add any tone. I want to make sure that I'm using language that is objective on purpose. But there was just a lot of noise that came out during the pandemic. Remember when the defunding the police noise was so loud we couldn't hear anything else, for example? Just about the time in which that subsided, we heard this growing noise, collective noise in the school system, particularly K-12, do away with critical race theory. What's going on here? What is leading to all this disagreement regarding the goals and the point of critical theory? We'll talk about that. But again, with this really started because I think that the hinge and the twinge has been the growing collective sentiments on both sides of the coin about critical race theory in particular. And so I just thought it was important that we don't make critical race theory the end all and be all, and we don't make critical race theory the scapegoat. What this time has provided us with now is an opportunity to get back to the roots, to the heart of the matter, to the truth. What is everybody up in arms about anyway? What is it? What's the fight? What fundamentally are we, if people use the word attack, and if people are in attack mode, what is it that they are attacking? And so these conversations, as with all right grounds, offer opportunities for us to talk about the current discourse, our culture that makes and continues to make America what it is, and all of the co-components of our coexistence, and the critical elements in critical theory, what makes it so critical. And some of the current space and what we're talking about right now is critical race theory because it has recently made headlines. I do remember interacting with at least one news personality to talk about critical race theory in K-12 and why in this arena, especially why in education when we're dealing with minors, we're dealing with children here, and the instruction that they're being taught in the classroom. What about the instruction in general has caused people such problem, and why critical race? This is important because we have bills as we speak that are underway that are seeking to ban the inclusion of any conversation that even leans or looks like it promotes race theory. There are a lot of bills that are underway as we speak. And when you see these bills, you won't necessarily see critical race theory, that specific language, but what you'll see is terms like indoctrination, terms like distortion, divisive concepts. Don't introduce anything that causes discomfort or guilt. As teachers, you have to remain objective. And so these are the ways in which language has been able to frame a lot of even the construction of these bills that I said, for example, are underway in states like Arizona, in Ohio, in Florida, Texas, some of the ones we expect, but maybe others that we don't expect. And again, a lot of these bills are underway even as we speak. And so public awareness just continues to, like I said, the social pulse has been changing anyway, and the pandemic, a lot of events occurred, and it was a prime opportunity for people to take a stand, if any at all. You stand for something, right? And all these residual and negative impacts of criminal justice policies, and America's longstanding history of ostracizing groups who do not fit the status quo. What makes this critical? We'll talk more about this in depth in the next couple of slides, but undoubtedly in any system in which there are inequities, it is worth talking about what equity looks like, what it's supposed to look like, and why this is so critical, particularly as we're talking about lineage and successive generations. More on this. To date, there continues to be lack of consensus regarding not just how we feel about critical theories and how they apply to our workspaces, to our schooling, to our environments, our communities. But what is the role of the government in rectifying these matters? Legal language, if you study law at all, you know that legal language tends to be overarching and broad enough on purpose so that the federal government can allow states the opportunity to decide within that state, those governors, what and how these laws and rules apply to that particular state. No problem, but how can we have a normative standard if every single state is left up to its own devices to decide what language to include and what not to include? So the lack of consensus, the lack of any agreement across the board, whether in a red state, a blue state, a purple state, that we're still talking about ground in which we don't have even commonality in what is critical, what matters, and how we're going to continue, right, building a lasting legacy for our current and future generations. The addition of children and their schooling only serves to intensify this debate, because do you remember a time in which parents really entrusted teachers to be guardians over their child's schooling? That this teacher obviously is well-versed and learned enough to understand what content should be applicable in 2nd grade and 6th grade and so on and so forth. I have a K-12 background, and I must tell you that any good teacher agonizes on a regular basis about limited resources and limitless needs. That's the name of the game anyway. So when you're an educator, you really want to make sure that you don't have all of the time in the world. You want to make sure that your students have the best instruction, but that they're prepared for life beyond. And so now, with parents battling with teachers, with school boards battling with superintendents, with principals in many respects stuck in the middle, the noise can get so loud at so many junctures and so many points that nobody really knows what's going on. And the children, as usual, are the ones who end up suffering. Again, I said this before, that there remains a growing need for us to solidify the ground we stand on. And so I look forward, even in these subsequent slides, for us to continue to explore and discuss what critical theory fundamentally is really about. Why does it matter at all? Why should we all care? Oh, I love a good history lesson. And so this very next slide is, I thought, was the next progression. Before we get into the different constructs and the different branches from the root of the tree of critical theory, let's look at a timeline, because it's important. If we're talking about standing on the same ground, it's important that we at least go through this historical timeline together. Not going through all of them, but moral criticism. This is about 1920s. Humanist, classical criticism, straight to the book. Didactic teaching qualities is as it sounds. The content is what the instruction is about. Stick to the rule book, stick to teaching what the content is, and remove pretty much the subjectivity that may or may not be involved with societal or political lean. And so this is about, I said 1920s, but that was really, we're not going back that far. We're really getting into the 1930s today, though. 1930s, we saw a new era of theory development and building. We're talking about formalism, and it was one of the first times that we had, on a substantial level anyway, something formative and something formal anyway, how formal elements like symbolism and irony, how they work together to really lend purpose and meaning to a text. So going beyond the didactic qualities of the text itself and just teaching by the book about the 30s. And psychoanalysis, we're mostly familiar with Freud. Jung, I have a counseling background, so a lot of these names are familiar when you're talking about growth and development of the individual. So symbolism, irony connected to text equals a greater purpose, a greater meaning beyond what it is we're reading in the text. Marxism, and putting the word Mark in Marxism, because that marked a turning point in which philosophers began to really look outward, outside of, first it was the text and the contents and the structure of what you're reading in the book. Then it was how it applied to the individual and that learning process and engaging with material and how you work from inward out. About the Marxism period, and this is 1930s to present, there was a new focus on interrelation, economic, and power positions. So not saying it was the first of its kind, but it was the first time at that time that we had some language and a construct in which we're looking more systematically, collectively, and the power of humanity as the capital that we have when we're a collective. Of course, I'm not getting into all of these constructs, but it's just really important that we notice that at its core, at the root, it was always about humans and the things that govern our understandings, power dynamics, balances and imbalances. In the colonial empire, of course, you don't have a colonial empire without colonizers and those who were colonized. And that even speaks to the power imbalances that we were seeing at the time. And we're talking 1990s to present. Feminist criticism, we really have a collective of research and facts and information on paper that speaks from the 1960s to present. You know, the suffrage movement started about the 1920s, but it still was some time coming before we had enough of a wealth of literature that we could actually cite from and point to. And then gender and queer studies, of course, 1970s to present. All of this is critical, and we'll get down to the core of it in a second, but notice the transition from text to purpose and meaning to what that means collectively, and how all of this really helps us as humans understand the relations that we have one with another. Now, this is a good Venn diagram because, as we know, no man is an island, and no person is one part person without all of the factors and the components that make us who we are. And so critical theory meets post-structuralism meets pragmatism. And then we're really talking not just about community, because community, as with any buzzwords, what does that mean until we apply it? It means understanding our role as members of a community. A critical theory has a very distinctive aim: to unmask ideologies that falsely justify some form of social or economic oppression, to reveal it as ideology, and in doing so, to contribute to the task of ending that oppression. And at its core, what makes critical theory what it is? The rights and responsibility that we have to, I know I threw in a cliche, but it's true. Now, this juxtaposition was a great visual, because I wanted us to see and understand, even in real time as we're having this conversation, that the layers, as you strip back one layer, there's another. You know, does this well ever really run dry when we talk about terms like privilege, aggressions, microaggressions? My husband and I not only wrote a book chapter on microaggressions, in which we just talk about the origins and the root of microaggressions, but we're actually working right now on what I call microaggressions 2.0. It's a piece in which we're looking and focusing on microaggressions as manifested in the workplace. Because in the workplace, there are a lot of decisions and a lot of things that are going on around you that are out of your control. And so it's really all about what it is you can control and how you can be empowered and not be a victim or an aggressor. But we'll talk about that in another time. Yeah, hegemonic powers, oppression, racism, heteronormativity, intersectionality. And now intersectionality, that's something that I've been able to also work through by way of my dissertation and by way of the pieces that I produced post-dissertation. Because as a Black woman, for example, there's no day in which I wake up and make a decision to be either Black or woman. Every day that I wake up, I am a Black woman. And so intersectionality just really speaks to the core of all the things that make you you, and in the effort to not strip away one for the sake of the other. And if we try to do that, we couldn't do it anyway, because what makes us who we are all those layers of biological and societal factors and experiences and relationships that really just make us unique. And so identity and the cultural component of the importance of us understanding the role, again, in which we interplay with each other. There's so much noise, but if we listen and focus in on what really matters, we understand that in this nation of 330 million, no islands here, and we all need each other. Understanding critical theory is important, because one of the things that happened immediately when I heard all this noise, I couldn't turn on the TV and not hear some article, some half-truth about critical race theory and a new conversation about another bill that's being promoted. books being removed from our school libraries, the shelves on a daily basis, and the wrestle was real. What is going on here, and how can I contribute to a conversation in which we strip back all the things people think they know and get to the truth about critical theory? Critical theory is a social theory, and it's oriented toward critiquing and changing society as a whole. It's so important because one would say traditional theories stop at the point at which they focus on an overarching explanation, some collective understanding of what's going on societally. And so a theory, in traditional fashion that explains and helps us understand our society as a whole better is great, but the critical element to critical theory digs a little bit further, digs beneath the surface, talks about our social lives, talks about the assumptions and the stereotypes and the misnomers and the half-truths. We call that the devil's lair on purpose, because like a wolf in sheep's clothing, by the time sometimes we get to the truth, it may not be too late. And so the critical theories that really dig beneath the surface, they are designed to help us understand those things, lock and key, that systemically insist on trying to hold us down, hold us back, keep us beneath a knee on our throat, on our necks, and really get to a better understanding of how to unlock that so that humans can really free what's free. We'll need another session on what the definition of free is, but be free from a system that is oppressive. If you're wondering who in the world these people are on this slide, I'm glad, because these are the members of the Frankfurt School. And when I say Frankfurt, yes, I mean Frankfurt, Germany, the original creators, founders, promoters, propitiators of critical theory, the likes of Horkheimer, Adorno, Fromm, Benjamin, and Habermas, to name a few. I thought that both of these slides were important because we're talking ideologies. We're talking about the roots and the core elements that really people will subscribe to and live their lives in accordance with what we believe to be. We're in an era of what, live your truth. Everyone speaks his or her own truth. That's great, but there are 8 billion people on this earth. Can you imagine what the world would possibly look like if we were all left up to our own devices to live whatever it is we see to be true? Alternative facts and living your own truth are 2 of my favorites. So these theorists here, why it's important that we at least get to the heart of the root of critical theory is because all the noise we're hearing right now speaks nothing to what critical theory is all about. At the time in which the Frankfurt School members got together, they were fighting then a Nazi regime, state capitalism, and at the time, the spread of mass-produced culture. Remember, we're talking about give or take 100 years ago as right now. And during that time and during that era, there was a rise of National Socialism. And one of the ways in which to have one's voice be heard was to write. And then you had people who didn't like these writings. And even at 100 years later, we're seeing books flying off of the shelves because of the content that's in these books. We do not understand our history. And if we do not learn from it, we are bound. Max Horkheimer is here, and this is his picture because I wanted us to look at the person who originally defined critical theory back in 1937. 2 things he asserted: that a critical theory must account for society within a historical context, and it should seek to offer a robust and holistic critique by incorporating insights from all social sciences. I think the operative word here is critique, because it's not critical necessarily to offer a critique, but you offer a critique so that something that exists can be made better, it can be improved. The expectation is that it's not where it needs to be, but with some feedback, some insights, with some direction, and with some critiquing, we don't settle for the status quo, and we don't settle for the minimum. One thing is has to be critical because we have to wrestle what it is we think we know and why as humans we're so inclined often to be complacent and to be happy with the status quo, and if it's not on my doorstep, right? So there goes one critical element. And the other, that a theory can only be considered true, a true critical theory, if it is explanatory, practical, and normative. Tangible, widespread, and something for which we actually have physical, tangible, palpable solutions, not to save the world, but to at least make our systems better. The theory itself, for it to be critical, and these are the original purposes, adequately explain the social problems that exist, but don't stop there. Don't offer an explanation about what you see the world to be if you don't have practical solutions for how to respond to the negatives, respond to the things that we need to improve on, and to really abide by the norms established by the field. So that's why research is so important. That's why research-based practice is so important, because then we're not pieing in the sky. We're not pulling truths from, well, our tails, but that there's rigor, that there's process, and that we, again, as a collective, understand what our role is in the big picture. So where is critical theory today? The expectation 100 years later is that it doesn't look the same way as it did in the 1930s or so, right? Not since the Frankfurt School, when they were the original pioneers of critical theory. What's important here is that, like I said earlier, I think this said this on the first slide, that we do not make critical race theory the be all and end all, and we do not scapegoat critical race theory, because the tree is critical theory and there are branches. Some of them I've listed today. We don't have time to cover them all. I'd love for us to really roll up our sleeves and dive into critical theories. But some of the notables, and some of you might know these, and if they're new for you, even better. CLT, which is critical legal studies. Critical legal studies really talks about how the law, because it is intertwined with social issues, proponents of CLT, proponents of CLT believe that the law supports the interests of those created. And because we're humans, there's no such thing as lack of bias. There's no such thing as pure objectivity, because we're human beings. And so critical legal theory speaks to how our laws are designed largely with the behind and supporting the frame of the lawmakers and the law influencers. And so it's not bound to fail, but we just need to understand that social biases tend to be inherent then, because of the fact that we're humans. And that's what critical legal theory really brings to the forefront. Critical race theory, despite all of the noise, simply, this is America, and we know that racism is institutionalized and that it is embedded in our system. The critical element is that because of that, there are winners and there are losers. So the counter argument to anyone who says, well, I didn't do this, my ancestors were the ones who had slaves or the like, or were, you know, the real oppressors. And the answer to that, though, is, are you a beneficiary? Because if you are, you too have a part to play in righting those wrongs and doing your part to not see inequities as they exist and go, well, I'm so thankful that's not me, and turn a blind eye. That's not the point. The critical is the societal element. It's us at least beginning by acknowledging the role we play in perpetuating the system that exists today. And some others, critical feminist theory, this is not feminists, well, it's not women versus men. It's not a versus. What it is we know that we have a longstanding patriarchal society. And so the root and the point of critical feminist theory is to have frames that exist from a female frame of reference. and not just the patriarchal male frame of reference that we're so subscribed to just because that's what we know. And so feminism and critical feminist theory is really just a response to extant longstanding patriarchal social structures. That makes sense? It's not about one versus the other. It's about decentering the male perspective so that there is room and opportunity to consider alternative, well, not alternative because it sounds as if it's one versus the other perspectives. I'll leave it at that. I hope you learned a couple of things today as far as the other critical theories that also exist, like critical cultural theory. And of course, again, there's a dominant culture, and then there are cultures that are less represented, and that doesn't make us minorities. That just means that your culture is less represented than what tends to be the normative standard here in the US. So what critical cultural theory looks at is just the dynamics between individuals, environments, the institutions in which they live, work, play, et cetera, and just how all of those social elements and conditions continue to frame our experiences. CET would be critical economic theory, and the economic portion obviously is the financial, those elements that impact cultures generationally from one to the next, for example, in housing. Housing inequities don't just impact one generation. That's residual because an undervalued house, undervalued land, undervalued property only depreciates in value from one hand to the next, and that adds up over time. And so that economic element is just financially free exchange, private property, capitalism as a framework. And because we're so subscribed to a capitalist society, again, there are winners and losers. You're in or you're out. And that's very dichotomous. Critical queer theory, obviously, used to challenge gender and sex-based roles and binaries, and at least have frames that speak to and represent those who do not subscribe or do not fit into any one of those defined categories. Media theory and media studies, the perpetuation of positive and negative imagery over time. What percentage of people, this is a hypothetical question, obviously, base everything they know about the world on what they see on TV? Now that's a reality. And so what the critical element in media theory and media studies is more positive imagery, more normalizes those positive elements for people. So, for example, as an instructor, when I taught students who did not look like me, there was oftentimes I taught STEM too. So in the STEM field in particular, I'd walk into a room and oftentimes there was surprise. Or you, a student here, and while I appreciate that, please, right? But the perpetuation of those, like why are you surprised in the first place? Is that a microaggression? What's happening in this moment? Maybe more positive imagery, seeing people like look like me in STEM, for example, would lead to less surprise because that's something that people would come to expect, and it doesn't have to be in and out. Critical theory today, as with culture, there's progressions, there are changes. Technology, for example, has been a primary factor in speeding up the way we communicate and interact with our brothers and sisters all over the world now. And so critical theory today has to evolve as well. Cultures change over time, people change over time, our locations change over time, our climate changes over time. How many national disasters, how many wars, how many generations have we been through since the founders of the Frankfurt School? And so if on one hand, your functionalist and conflict theories, they argue that culture is a reflection of society, critical theorists argue that societies are too messy, it's too complex, and they're way too fluid to be described as systems. And that is not possible to try to come up with any one general explanation of social life that's ever going to be applicable to all people, in all societies, at all times in history. As culture evolves and changes over time and varies, and we continue to grow, hopefully one generation to the next, so should our wrestling of critical theories and what they're designed to do, who they're designed for, and what fundamentally this is all about. Why should we care? Why does this matter? That's a good reason. That's a good question. Why does it matter? That's a good question. It's a good question because, like I said, it's so easy to say, well, I'm one person, so my voice doesn't count, my vote doesn't matter, I can't be the change. Obviously, none of those things are true, but that's the safe way out. It's much more convenient and much more easy to say, well, I can't do anything about it. So what's the big deal and what's so critical about all of this anyway? The answer is, in a nutshell, this is going to continue to be critical as long as inequities continue to exist. And so even as we're looking at this visual and the layers, I think the layers really offer a great opportunity for us to see how many, because imagine every time you jump from one hoop, you have to now deal and handle with the next hoop. Imagine that this is just you trying to get out of your house on a daily basis to face the day. So there are matters and concerns one must have to deal with on an intrapersonal level, not to mention then on the interpersonal level, intra, within, inter, others in our community, institutionally, on a community level, on a systemic level. And now imagine these matters, these sounds, these voices, these attacks, these oppressions impacting you on a regular basis. Let's not even mention whether or not you have some type of disability or any other mitigating factor that would really just add to these layers. Just on a regular, systemic, or daily basis, consider some of the things that many of us in varying levels, an equity walk, for example, is always a good practice. I've done it as a student, done it as an educator, and an equity walk really gives the collective environment an opportunity to see in real time who the things that you might think are nothing to you and what a big deal that would be for someone else. And so just because inequities exist, the critical component here is the fact that we can't ever point to a problem without also having a conversation about the solution. We're wasting our time. So racism, stereotypes, banking, housing, discrimination, bias, these are some ugly words, but they're not just words. These are many, 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 many people's lived experiences every day. And the critical element is the fact that we all have to live together, and we all have to care. Taking a look at this visual in this framework, I just thought it was important for us to look at again some of the layers that lead from root cause to outcomes. And we're not looking at anything that impacts any one person, any one generation. Did you know? Do you know about the Alpha generation? Sidebar, but not really. We're spending all of our time talking about millennials and Gen Zers. And the Alpha generation are the people who were born between 2010 and mid 2020s, meaning the Alpha generation, they're still being born every day, but that generation beginning point is 2010. Why is that significant? Because the Alpha generation is the only generation entirely born in this millennium. The world is changing. We are changing. Our laws, our systems, our structures, our stereotypes, our biases, yeah, we all need to, at least at minimum, be growing at somewhat of the same pace, because there is an incongruence between, as humanity, where we think we are and where we actually are. And so where do we go from here? Well, the easy answer is doing nothing is not an option. Because this impacts every single one of our systems. Okay, so, yeah, inequities might exist, but I've only really seen it in the criminal justice system. That couldn't be further from the truth. Anecdotals are anecdotals for a reason, but we add up how many hundreds and thousands and millions of anecdotals before we really acknowledge the truth. The truth of the matter is there are inequities in healthcare. There are inequities in our education system, in banking, in housing, and in criminal justice. And look at the cycle. we do nothing about it, we can't expect anything to change, and we can definitely expect this cycle to not only continue, but to potentially degenerate. And there are many benefits for all of us and to all of us to being good stakeholders, because we hopefully, among other things, want to have a world for our future generations to live and thrive on, right? And so it starts today. What about improving access to public transit? What about us doing our part to promote flexible and inclusive workplaces? For example, I remember I did an equity audit while still in Chattanooga, looking at the structures, the K-12 buildings. And can I tell you that at least 90% of the buildings I looked at were not accessible for people in wheelchairs? How's that for inequity? If someone was in a wheelchair in most of these schools, there was no ramp at the time for that person to access to actually get into the building. So if you had a wheelchair at that time, because that was a while ago, I'm expecting that something's changed since then. But for example, at that time, if you had a wheelchair, you just either had to stay outside in the parking lot or not come at all. Can you imagine? Healthcare, we talked about before. Streets that are pedestrian and bike friendly. Accessible is okay, but friendly is better. Promoting affordable housing and homes that are walkable and offer basic amenities. Supporting, in particular, agencies that are already doing great work. I had a class, an honors class, that had an action learning component connected to the class. And one of the requirements for my students was to scour their neighborhood, scour their area, the area in which they live, and align with an agency that's doing some work that you subscribe to or agree with, believe in, can align with. And the vast majority of them kept saying things like, I had no idea. I didn't even know that across the street from me, I didn't even know that down the block from me, all of this great work was happening. And as a matter of fact, now I'm volunteering, now I have an internship opportunity, now I'm doing my part. Where do we go from there? Exactly that. But we don't have to do 8 ways to be a better ally. Do your research. Facebook, social media, not even Facebook. I want to start listing out all the outlets. Social media is not research. So if you want to be a better ally, do your research and at least be armed with the truth, because there's no changing anything until we have our facts together, right? Listen. So don't black-splain, man-splain, woman-splain somebody else's experience. If someone is sharing, first of all, that person's comfortable enough to share, be happy that that's happening, but be a good listener. Don't practice performative allyship. Do anything for the accolades or the fame or the cameras. Do it because it's the right thing to do. Speak up in your own social circles. One of the hardest things to do is to tell someone he or she's wrong, or stop somebody, correct someone in the moment and say, that's not, you shouldn't be doing that. That's one of the hardest things to do, but it makes one a good ally, and practice makes better. Doesn't make perfect, but it makes better. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because comfort is a privilege, particularly for the people who aren't. So if you are in a position where you can choose to be comfortable and not comfortable, think about the privileges that come along with that. Learn from your mistakes, we all can. Amplify the voices and messages of the underrepresented, and show up. One of the most important things you can do to be a better ally is to be present, to be there, and to be ready and willing. All of this is to say, the critical element in critical theory is such that we are not here to talk about any one component. We societally, we as a community, we as a collective, we've got to do better, and we all have to do our part. And this does not just impact K-12, K-20, the CJ system, and other microsystems. All these systems are residuals and perpetuations of our society systemically as a whole. I appreciate all of you coming here today, because if you're here today, that means you are at least committed on some level to doing your part, and for us to continue to have these critical and important conversations going forward. I've learned a lot even in pulling this together. I said critical theory, intersectionality, these are frames that I will never depart from. And I look forward to our continued conversations even as I close, and I want to hear your questions and I want to engage with you further. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Really appreciated that. Really, as you were talking, I'm curious. Can you talk about the roots of your own interest in critical theory as a way of thinking about all these things that you bring up? Where did that start for you?
That's a great question. Thank you. I remember, oh boy, this was 2016 when I came into the Ed Lead program, the doctoral program at Georgia State University. And that summer I began. That first semester, I was Black Girls Plymouth Rock. Black Girls Plymouth Rock, and I'm going to speak on behalf of all the Black girls and the Black women. And it was so funny because I was so Black Girls Plymouth Rock. And I remember my advisor slash professor at the time, whatever I submitted, it came back red. There was just a bunch of red. You're trying to do too much. You're trying to save the world. You just have too much going on. And I wrestled that summer. I said, well, if I'm not here to be an activist, if I'm not here to be an ally, what am I doing? What am I here for? And yeah, it took a look in the mirror. I looked in the mirror, and I just remember looking in the mirror silently and saying, you know what? Where does change begin? And this is in my head. This is my intro conversation was, where does change begin? It begins with me. I'm not trying to be Black Girls Plymouth Rock. I'm not trying to do all of these things. I am looking at the contribution that I am here to make. Well, who am I? What am I doing here? What is my purpose? What is my point? So I would just say that it caused me to strip down everything I thought I was here to do and layer everything out and start over. Well, I'm a Black woman. Well, I'm a child of immigrants. I'm a New Yorker. I'm the firstborn in my generation. And as I removed the layers and restacked them, there was a renewed sense of purpose, a renewed sense of mission. And that was where I initially found critical theory. Now, at the time, I was looking at critical race feminist theory because critical race theory focuses on Blackness and on race overarchingly. And so all of us who really speak to and identify as Black, critical race theory, I think really speaks to the core elements of what life looks like for us on a daily basis. And then you have the feminist theory element, where as a woman, well, my experiences are very unique, different from my male counterparts. And so how in one frame and in one way, and with a dissertation, dissertation's long, but it can't be 1,000,000 pages, right? And so in the juxtapositioning of those two frames, and when I really uncovered critical race feminist theory, I really found as if I had the language and the voice to speak not only to the experiences of the ostracized, but as a Black woman, a frame that really I felt heard. I felt listened to. I felt like this frame really, I felt understood by the description of how it spoke to my experiences.
Absolutely. And as you were talking, I was thinking, for people who have done work in critical theory, and of course, and you named it, the Frankfurt School comes up as kind of the center. That's like the beginning of critical theory. That's kind of like, that's the source of critical theory. Looking back at the Frankfurt School, over time, one of the critiques, say, for instance, of the Frankfurt School and critical theory, coming out of a pretty traditional Marxist perspective, right? That the most primary contradiction in society is the class contradiction, is a critique of critical theory that it it had a blind spot to the racial colonial contradiction, that problem in society. And so we've, a lot of people would argue that while the Frankfurt School has been important, also we have to identify those, for instance, those Black critical theorists who have developed an Africana critical theory. Du Bois was doing a very similar thing to the Frankfurt School in the early 20th century. C.L.R. James, right? Critiquing British, what's that game like baseball that I think you're a West Indian, right?
Cricket.
Right. C.L.R. James critiquing cricket, right? Giving an analysis, both a race class analysis, obviously with decolonial and post-colonial theory, Frantz Fanon, all these Black thinkers, right? Coming up, as for instance, as you talk to your students about critical theory, how do you talk about that blind spot, say some of the early critical theorists from the Frankfurt School, and for instance, and how Black scholars have folded in and really enriched critical theory?
That's good, because the only reason I start there is because I need to start there. I think a lot of times I see students come in and there is a righteous, I don't even know what to call it, but there's a spirit that comes with, well, there's so many people who think critical theory is critical race theory, and they stop there, and there's so many, like I said, economic and cultural and queer and feminist. And so the reason I start there is because when I put up a German face, a face that from someone 100 years ago, I see some of that stripped down immediately. Like, now we can have conversations about the unfolding and the layering. And I'm going back 100 years on purpose so that they can see that with so much that has changed, so much still hasn't. And but I definitely, I don't shy away from our current, I wish I had all the time. I wish I had more time, but that's the reason why I start there. I open with the Frankfurt School because people tend to be surprised. They tend to think, and because we're in America, and so we're never going to have conversations about inequities and not also have conversations about race. That's our reality, always be. And so, I don't at all deny the fact that there was a blind spot, because they can't speak to the Black experience, but I can. And my allyship, my community of great stakeholders, you included, can. They can come in and we can align, and they can see things beyond the conversations they're having amongst themselves and in their households, because I don't know what percentage of my students get their news from social media. So
A lot. I'm wondering, and I see one question up there. I'm going to come back to it. I just have one more thing to ask in terms of in your own teaching. Critical theory looks at it casts what some people call a hermeneutic of suspicion, an interpretation of suspicion, looking at the imbalances, the asymmetrical relationships, whether it's class, gender, race, sexuality, and then investigates how those asymmetrical relationships and the stories we tell about them support oppressions. And I'm wondering, is that something? How do you go about training your students how to have that kind of hermeneutic of suspicion, to be able to look at those asymmetrical relationships in society, and then from a theoretical perspective, say, this is the challenges that we want to make to this situation? I don't know if that made sense, what I just asked you.
I think so. But how to, because
how do we convey this to our students?
And then yes, didactic teaching is such that here's what the book says, learn what the book says, and that's it. And really, for them, what's beyond that is for them to be able to see it in some way. For example, I teach CJ stats right now. We're teaching stats, and one of the most important things for my students to see is that each data point represents a person. Each data point represents a life course, a trajectory. we've had conversations about, the average person can't make bail. And we're talking about $50 or $100 bail.
Mhm.
And I remember when I put the numbers up on the board and the student said, oh, they're cheap. And it wasn't that they're cheap. This is a poverty issue. But right, you said I can convey this message, and I'm glad we had that was an opportunity for engagement and learning and a real conversation. Because the point at which she said, "Oh well, $50 and $100, that person must be cheap." Oh my goodness. These are the things that we're here to. We can't dispel everything, but we can at least, and I did stop and have a real conversation. What causes you to say that? Is that what you saw? Because that's not at all what I saw. And I love the most, because I'm controversial, I'd say, in class on purpose, because I find that it's one of the few opportunities they have to be able to wrestle in a safe space. It's okay. Agreeing to disagree. And for me, it's that level of engagement. They really, when I say they get riled up, I mean in a good way.
Excited.
But they get excited. And everyone comes with their experiences. There's no one more engaged than the person to whom you ask, tell me about your lived experience. It's great what the book says, and it's great what we're seeing on the news and on the TV, but what is it that you see in your community, in your relationships? Law is another thing. We talk about law and we talk about the justice system, and there's so many half-truths that people hold. I don't know how many times a student said to me, I just assumed that people who were older knew about the justice system or knew who our local and state and national leaders were, and don't. And so, yeah, there's, from one semester to the next, you can't do it all, but I always enjoy having them intentionally wrestle. But the critical element in critical theory is that for many, it's easy to point to a problem. That's the easy part. The hard part is acknowledging our role and committing to the solution. And that's what I think traditional theory, where it stops. I won't say falls short, but like that's where it ends. And like I said, having students join agencies, having them ally, having them reach out, having them connect whenever anything is going on at the law school. If we can make it, we make it. When anything is going on at the ethics center, we make it. Some things have changed since COVID, but now that we're getting back into being in person again, that's been picking up. And so having them see that they are today stakeholders and that they don't have to wait till they graduate or have some, plethora of degrees, but that you're a justice agent today.
Okay. Thaddeus asked a question. How do you think the omission of these perspectives from policy, law, and reform has impacted marginalized communities? And Thaddeus, I'm assuming you mean the perspectives of critical theory from policy, law, and reform. Yes, he says yes.
How they impact?
How do you think the omission of these critical theory perspectives from policy, law, and reform has impacted the marginalized communities?
That's great. The important word was omission, and so I'm glad I got that the second time around. It's false. The omission of the voices of people who are underrepresented, the voices of people who are marginalized, it's the sin. I call it the sin. In the journalistic community, we call that the sin of omission because there's intent behind it. And in that intent, there is a cause for division. And so, yeah, it is hermeneutic in nature, because you see your exclusion in the processes of law making, law impacting, policy production. And really, politics as usual, the only time, a lot of times we see lawmakers is when it's time to get out the vote. I'm going to run up this ticket, I'm going to do all these things for you and your community. And then we elect you to office, and oftentimes not a peep until it's time to be reelected. So these things are residual. Our children see that. Our current and future generations see that. Well, the what's the word? The excuse is, well, if my voice doesn't count, And if what I say doesn't matter anyway, why should I even try? Why should I even engage? Why should I vote? Why should I run for public office? Why should I further my education? And so, yeah, there's no Band-Aid fixes or solutions, but the effects are residual and longstanding and generational.
Mm. How can you talk about the importance of critiquing language to kind of take away some of those structural ideas that support oppression? So challenging some of the linguistic structures that challenge that. And for instance, in Africana studies, you know, one of the first things that we challenge students with is how they conceptualize our enslaved ancestors by, first of all, seeing them as enslaved people as opposed to being slaves, and understanding how language creates structures that support forms of oppression or that support assumptions. And in your work, can you talk about how you've seen that?
I not only agree, but another one that's really minorities. Minorities versus being in the minority, being a member of a underrepresented group. Because, right, minority, what does that mean? You are a minority, that's labeling. And so, yeah, these labels that we don't even realize the subconscious, and then the layers that they add, right? A Black child. Look at it in the English language, how negative the word Black is. The prefix Black, there are just so many, yeah, like I said, negative messages and images, even the Black list. And I don't have an entire list, but just, yeah, we wrestle. And like I said, in real time, ethics is another class where we really get to have those types of conversations, to hear sometimes the explanations or even hear the self-labeling. It's really sad when I do hear self-labeling, because I know it doesn't come from nowhere, it came from somewhere. But yeah, I see it as my part and responsibility for us to, and I'm tapping into my dissertation chair, because her favorite words to say were, you have to trouble the word. I'd write a sentence and think I was getting away with it, and she'd highlight something and say, you need to trouble. She's also Caribbean, West Indian, so that makes sense. So yeah, troubling and wrestling, and then not taking any labels at face value, definitely not subscribing to any label that's been given, right? And that's a two-way street. One of the benefits to teaching CJ students is that they are going to be our law enforcement personnel within the next couple of years. And so it matters that you're not just here because you want to run and gun, because of what you saw on TV, NCIS and such, that our decisions are not just individual, that they have lasting impact to and for our communities. And so these are all the ways in which we need to do our part.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I'm trying to see if there are any other questions for Dr. Johnson. Give it a second here. I'm a therapist by practice, Dr. Johnson, and we call this a therapeutic silence. It's okay. We let the silence, let people melt in their thoughts.
Isn't that great? I love that, because have them mull, right? One of my favorite words, just mull over that for a minute. Just let that resonate.
There you go. And well, if there are no further questions, I want to just thank you, Dr. Johnson, on behalf of the, I see all you got to do is start closing and somebody comes up. They thought they got it. Denise says, I really like your emphasis on our interconnectedness and how we affect each other. She says, thank you. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Denise, for that feedback as well. I appreciate that. Again, on behalf of the Africana Studies Department, I'd like to thank you for participating in this last lecture of the semester. Everybody should know that we will be coming back with the Freedom School in the fall. If you are a scholar and would like to participate in our Freedom School. Dr. Lakita Bailey is our coordinator for that. And you can connect with her at lbonnette, LBONNETTE at gsu.edu. That's lbonnette, LBONNETTE at gsu.edu. If you're a scholar who would like to present your ideas here at the Freedom School, we'd be excited and happy to talk to you about that. Again, Dr. Johnson, thank you for really doing this great wrap up for the semester. I look forward to hearing more about the work that you do, the research you do, and perhaps having some more conversations with you on this idea of critical theory.
Thank you, Doc, and thanks to all of the stakeholders who put this together and who do this Freedom Series. I appreciate aligning with all of you, and I can't wait to do it again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have a great night.